Okay. Produced. Welcome, everyone. We're so happy you could be here for this webinar, which I'm sure you will find to be very interesting. It'll be presented by Dr. Ornato, who is Professor of Emergency Medicine and Internal Medicine at Virginia Commonwealth University and Medical College of Virginia in Richmond. He's also an affiliated professor, VCU College of Engineering, Department of Computer Science, and he's medical director of the Richmond Ambulance Authority and Richmond Fire and EMS. He's a very active researcher, and he's led some of the major trials related to resuscitation in the US. And right now he's working as in collaboration with Duke University on a $4 million American Heart Association grant, a program that will implement the first US programs to deliver AEDs to bystanders by drone to treat out of hospital cardiac arrest. And he is actually a pilot also and a cardiac arrest survivor. So welcome, Dr. Ornato. Thank you for being here today.
Thanks, Mary, and thanks for all that you do. Mary and I have been friends and collaborators for years. It's always a joy to be associated with her and the rest of the team at CASA. The purpose of my presentation is, as Mary has indicated, to tell you, as we get towards the tail end of this presentation, tell you a little bit about our project. But the real theme of the presentation, as I put it together, is that we're not saving but a handful of out-of-hospital cardiac arrest victims. We are all among the lucky few, those of us that have had an out-of-hospital cardiac arrest, but we're only one of the 5 or 10% who survive. And that statistic, as stark and surprising it is to many folks, is going to be very difficult to change at an affordable price for communities using the same kind of model that we have now called the 911 first responder dispatch, police, fire, and EMS, and advanced life support. And you'll see why in a short period of time that model can likely never do a whole lot better than it's doing currently, because the problem is we just physically can't get people and individuals with AEDs to the victim quickly enough to really improve the percent of individuals who we could save. So with that, let me quickly move forward and tell you that a term that most of you know, which is the chain of survival, is really the mantra that's guided our American Heart and Red Cross programs for years, but we're kind of hitting the wall with it in its current form. And so what I'm going to try to quickly do is show you why we're hitting the wall and indicate how really it's the time to treatment that is preventing us from saving more people, not the effectiveness of treatments such as defibrillation or shocking the heart in 70 or 80% of the cardiac arrest victims out of hospital. And so this presentation is going to discuss where I believe our field is going in EMS, which is to explore the use of drones to deliver things like automated external defibrillators or AEDs for cardiac arrest victims, intranasal naloxone for bystanders at the scene of a opioid overdose, and other things are possible to deliver, like stop the bleed kits and epinephrine pens for anaphylactic situations. Most of you are very familiar with, sadly, what a cardiac arrest victim looks like. These are two examples from the distant and very recent past. The first is an event that appeared on national TV back in 1990 in a championship game on the West Coast for college basketball. One of the stars of that era was a fellow named Hank Gathers at age 23. And sadly, he developed a cardiac arrest on the court before all of the stands and all of the TV watchers throughout the nation. That was at a time before AEDs were available to the public. They did exist. They came on the market for EMS in the early to mid 1980s, but they did not exist and they were not required to be in public places like athletic stadiums. And sadly, Mr. Gathers did not survive. Contrast that with what we all saw last year, or at least those of us who were watching the Monday night football game between the Buffalo Bills and the Cincinnati Bengals, when Damar Hamlin got a sharp blow to the chest and experienced a condition called commotio cordis, whereby if you strike the chest in just the right place, I say right, it's really the wrong place, just by accident, and it hits at a very, very specific part of the heart cycle, it can trigger an episode of cardiac arrest. Fortunately, there are less than 100 people in the United States per year out of the hundreds of million, less than 100 that actually have this kind of cardiac arrest. But as all of the onlookers, including myself, witnessed, the system that was in place had trainers on the field literally in a minute or two performing CPR after they recognized that Damar was pulseless. Soon thereafter, the AED that was on the sideline was used to defibrillate him. And within 9 minutes of his collapse on the field, he was on a stretcher on the back of an ambulance being taken to the University of Cincinnati, where he received state-of-the-art care, got cooled down to a temperature in the low 90s for the next 72 hours. And as we're all so well aware, he not only survived neurologically intact, but is back playing professional ball again. When a cardiac arrest occurs, if the person is upright and walking around, within literally less than 20 seconds of the heart rhythm stopping and turning into the most common rhythm for cardiac arrest called ventricular fibrillation.
Which facility?
Within 20 seconds or so, the person will lose consciousness and collapse to the ground. I have to tell you a little bit about the details of the heart. Many of you know these details, so I'm going to very quickly go through them, but I think they're important for everyone to understand, to see where drones can play potentially a vital role in saving more lives. The heart has the main function of pumping blood to the lungs to pick up oxygen, where it then returns back to the left side of the heart, and the heart squirts that blood to all areas of the body, including the brain. The heart normally has an electrical system, and that electrical system keeps the beat, if you will. And so what winds up happening is the upper chambers, called the atria, squirt blood into the lower chambers, called the ventricles. The right ventricle squirts blood to the lungs, where they pick up oxygen, returns the blood back to the left atrium, dumps it into the left ventricle. And then when the heart squeezes, that blood goes out the aorta and goes to all areas of the body, including the brain. When cardiac arrest occurs suddenly, unexpectedly, in otherwise what seems to be a healthy person out of hospital, 70 to 80% of the time, the heart goes into a chaotic rhythm called ventricular fibrillation. And so instead of the lower chambers beating rhythmically, they suddenly stop pumping blood because they quiver like a bowl of jelly. And in this simulation animation, this is literally what they look like. There are four things that determine whether a victim of this kind of cardiac arrest is going to survive. And the four determinants all depend on time. First, whether it's witnessed, and if so, whether the witnesses can quickly call for additional help. And in the United States, it means calling 911 quickly. Performing chest compressions. You don't need, and American Heart and Red Cross no longer insist on teaching CPR where you do mouth ventilation. Turns out that the lungs in someone who suddenly collapses, the lungs typically have enough oxygen to sustain the vital organs for about 6 minutes. And if you do chest compressions, you're actually causing some air to move in and out of the lungs, and you're moving blood around the body. So that 6 minutes can be extended. Now, you're only able to provide with CPR about a quarter, a third of the normal blood flow and oxygen delivery to the tissues, but it's certainly better than nothing. So the second element is, of course, as you know, CPR. The third is as quickly as possible, if it is possible, to get a defibrillator to the scene, an automated external defibrillator. They're FDA approved since about 2001 or 2002, and they're very simple to use. Some of you have been trained to use them. Some of you have used them. And they literally talk you through the very simple steps to apply them. It determines whether the heart needs to be shocked, and if so, it will prompt you to push a button, or in some of the defibrillators, they'll actually tell you stand back at one point, and it will actually deliver the shock itself. It then will check for return of a normal rhythm. But while it's checking for a normal rhythm for the next 2 minutes, it will typically tell you to continue pumping on the chest. And the last step is when the advanced providers, the EMS cavalry, arrive, and they can provide additional treatments if they are required, including defibrillation, IVs, drugs, and at the hospital level, cooling. Back in the early 1990s, I was privileged to be vice chair of the American Heart Association National Emergency Cardiac Care Committee. That's the committee that oversees the ACLS, Advanced Life Support, Basic Life Support, Pediatric Life Support, and now First Aid guidelines nationally. A year or two after this publication, after serving for 3 years as vice chair, I became chair of that national committee for the next 3 years. Rich Cummins from Washington, at the time that we wrote this paper in the early 90s, myself, Paul Pepe, who's now in Florida, and Bill Thies, one of the AHA staffers, produced a concept called the chain of survival. If I remember correctly, Mary had a very important historical role in the development of this concept as well. But suffice it to say that that's kind of been the guiding light. We've kind of tweaked it a little bit through the years, and it's got a little more detail, but the essence is pretty much still very valid. Now, okay, let's get into why I'm saying time to treatment is the problem. If you look at how we can reverse ventricular fibrillation in a human being, the best model I can give you is when a patient is having an implantable defibrillator put in by any of us cardiologists in the electrophysiology lab. In the early days, when we would implant the device in the chest, at the end of the procedure, while the person's under anesthesia, we would typically put a pacing catheter in through the vein into the right side of the heart and pace the heart very quickly and actually throw it into ventricular fibrillation. Now you might say, well, why on earth would we do that? Well, the reason is because we wanted to be sure that the implantable defibrillator could sense it and actually within 15 or 20 seconds would defibrillate, and that defibrillation would be successful. And in fact, in the electrophysiology lab, and these are people, many of whom have significant heart disease, So these aren't perfectly normal, healthy people. Most of them have had a cardiac arrest and survived previously. 9,999 out of 10,000 of these patients who get thrown into VFib in the EP lab immediately come out with that first shock and survive perfectly normal. So the problem is not that we can't get rid of the VFib. The problem is we're not there immediately within 20 seconds when it happens in most cases, except in the ICU or the EP lab, et cetera, the operating room. Now, back in the early 2000 period, Terry Valenzuela, emergency medicine physician from the Southwest, had access to, through a friend of his, to cameras that recorded cardiac arrests on the gaming floor in Vegas casinos. And what he found was that before AEDs were available, the survival when EMS had to be called 911 and responded quickly, got to the gaming floor, found the person in cardiac arrest, and shocked them at minute 8 on average, they only saved 10%. Along came the option of training and equipping the security guards in the casinos with AEDs, and special permission was given by the FDA for a study to be done, which Terry was in charge of. And he trained the casino security officers to respond on the gaming floor. And they were on the gaming floor, so it was literally within seconds or minutes for them to get to the victim. If the shock was delivered within 3 minutes, proven by the videotape that Terry was able to review afterwards, if the shock occurred at 3 minutes, 3/4 of these victims survived neurologically intact to leave the hospital. If the shock took another 2 minutes before the guards could get to the victim and attach the defibrillator and shock them, they still saved 50%. So you see there's a rapidly declining curve. And that's what prompted us to say, for every minute delay until the first defibrillation shock, you drop survival by about 10%. Now, the challenge is how can we get defibrillation done much more quickly than the 8, where you're going to see the average is probably 11 to 14 minutes in most EMS systems, even in urban and suburban areas. And the reason is that during this period of time that the heart is in ventricular fibrillation, it's burning up the fuel inside each of the cells. The fuel in the heart muscle cells has a fancy name. It's called ATP. And what happens is the ATP levels, and this was actually measured in an animal model back in 1991 at Ohio State. And what it shows is that the fuel inside the cells, the heart muscle cells, drops very rapidly. Within 5 minutes, it's down to half of what it was. And that's what keeps that heart muscle alive and beating and shaking vigorously. By 10 minutes or 8 or 10 minutes, the heart muscle is basically almost motionless. Now, this is a video that I'm going to show you of an animal heart. It's actually a pig heart. The pig, by the way, in the end survived just fine in an animal operating room with a colleague of mine from Sweden. And this is a pig in which cardiac arrest occurs in the operating room, and the pig heart goes into ventricular fibrillation. And you'll see what I mean in a second. This is the heart, and it's fibrillating. The upper chambers are up here, the atria. This is the right ventricle and the left ventricle, and you see they're just twitching. And it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger because there's no blood flow. The blood from the veins is continuing to just hydraulically come into the heart. And by 5 or 6 minutes, the heart has turned blue, a shock is given, and it fails. Because the heart is opened, the CPR that's being done is with the gloved hand of the surgeon. And you can see that it is able to get the heart to a normal size. And now one shock, and all of a sudden the heart starts back up. The pig is taken off anesthesia, wakes up, and is perfectly fine. So what I really wanted to emphasize is ventricular fibrillation and cardiac arrest due to ventricular fibrillation, which is 70–80% of the collapses and cardiac arrest out of hospital, is very, very treatable. The problem is time. And unfortunately, the toll is horrendous in the United States, about 300,000 cardiac arrest deaths per year. And that means every 2 minutes, there's an out-of-hospital cardiac arrest in the United States. What's our survival nationally? Well, about half of the 300,000 cardiac arrest cases are not witnessed and don't survive. EMS, when they get to the scene, if the body shows signs that it's been deceased, has rigor mortis, et cetera, is cold, there's no way to even begin resuscitation with any hope of success. So 50% of the time, we don't even have any way of intervening. But for the 50% that are witnessed and EMS gets there, we attempt to shock them. About 70%, as I indicated, we think initially are in a shockable rhythm called ventricular fibrillation, like I just showed you. But we only save about 1 in 5. And actually, after COVID, it's now down to about 17%. Part of it is due to the fact that COVID has taken a toll on healthcare and really all of us in every walk of life. But healthcare, hospital workers, nurses, and paramedics, EMTs, and police officers nationally we have about 20 to 22% fewer than before COVID. So our response time intervals, sadly, are even longer. Now, if you look at the fact that only about 1 in 5 or 20% of out-of-hospital cardiac arrest victims are in ventricular fibrillation, the question is, okay, when I showed you ventricular fibrillation in the animal and the human drops with every passing minute that they stay in cardiac arrest if no CPR is being done. By the time you get down to 20% as the initial rhythm, you're 14 minutes out in this large series of almost 600 patients in North Carolina. So basically, I'm saying, well, 14 minutes. Most EMS systems take pride in saying their response time interval is 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 minutes in urban areas, and maybe 7 or 8 or 9 minutes in suburbs, and of course longer in rural areas, and very, very long in remote areas. So how could it be that only 20% of patients still have a shockable rhythm when EMS gets there? Here's the reason why. We don't know how many minutes it takes for a witness to figure that the person, oh my God, they didn't just faint, and grab a phone and call 911. On a good day, it's probably between 1 and 3 minutes. The fastest 911 centers, and we're fortunate in the city of Richmond to have a state-of-the-art system like Seattle and many other cities. We can get that first unit on the road within about 60 seconds of the pickup of the call. Add to that response time to drive, the so-called response time interval of 5 to 8 to 10 minutes. And that's what is reported in most publications on cardiac arrest.
We're on the line. Is virtual transfer on the line as well?
I'm sorry.
What would the logistics look like as far as ground? Because we're under the gun for time for
someone needs to get
out
muted.
there.
Okay, what are the logistics for transport? The physical time that it takes to drive the distance. That's the problem. But the problem is with the response time interval, what's reported is when the unit gets to the curb. Then it takes the typical 1 to 2 minutes to find the patient, to start unpacking the equipment, to attach the defibrillator, initiate CPR, manage the airway. So you're no longer dealing with a 5 minute to the shock in average, I'm talking about. you're generally dealing with much longer. And these are figures that are pretty consistent across most major studies. I had the privilege of running for 12 years all of the out-of-hospital cardiac arrest studies, randomized clinical trials funded by the National Institutes of Health from 2005 to 2017. We had 8 US and 2 Canadian cities and their metro areas and some rural areas involved in the projects doing randomized controlled trials on out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. And collectively, we ran over 20,000 cardiac arrests per year with 268 EMS agencies. Our median response time to the curb was about 6 minutes. So these are excellent systems. About 9 minutes until the advanced life support paramedic unit arrived. These are first units or first responders, most of whom have a defibrillator. But the first defibrillation shock was estimated at about 11 minutes after call receipt. So you're really talking about a lot later than most people, including a lot of folks in the medical world, think we're actually physically capable of achieving in terms of getting very prompt defibrillation done for out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. One of the first studies that we ran was back in early 2000s, 2000 to 2002. It involved 23 cities, again, National Institutes of Health funded study. I had the privilege of being the chairperson for this trial. American Heart and Red Cross worked with us as their volunteers and trained 19,000 laypersons in 23 US and Canadian cities. And the trial was to test whether lay people could save more lives if they were given AEDs close to where they lived or worked. We deployed over 1,500 AEDs in half of the sites. Every 3 months, we would rotate which sites would actually have the AED. All of the lay people were trained to recognize a cardiac arrest, call 911. And if there was an AED, fetch it, bring it back, and use it. At the end of 18 months, when the layperson had, and CPR was being done by all of the people that we trained. The only variable was whether they had access to an AED and could use it before EMS got there. When the AED was used, they doubled the number of survivors neurologically intact. That was statistically significant. And based on that, the Food and Drug Administration allowed lay people to have access to AEDs from that point forward. A few months after that, the American Heart Association worked with Congress and the President's office and got the Cardiac Arrest Survival Act passed. And shortly thereafter, that legislation required all federal public buildings, airports, and commercial aircraft to have AEDs on board and people trained in their use. Our teams were privileged to make that happen. And so I'm personally very positive, of course, about what we've accomplished with AEDs. We estimate, when I say we, the American Heart Association has estimated we save about 10,000 additional cardiac arrest out of hospital victims per year in the United States when laypersons have used an AED. But that's 10,000 out of 300 or so thousand cardiac arrests per year in the United States. So how can we enhance the survival? We've got effective therapy with CPR and with early defibrillation. How can we dramatically, potentially make those numbers better? Well, a terrific idea came forward from California. A firefighter, I think, was instrumental in this, which was a system that many of you are aware of called Pulse Point. It's available, City of Richmond. We have, for example, Pulse Point. And what it does is it allows lay people, rescuers, to sign up to be toned out by our 911 system when our units are responding to a cardiac arrest that's within a very short walk or running distance of the rescuer. And they're even prompted to go fetch an AED because our 911 systems actually show where an AED is and whether it's within a 2-minute fetch of the rescuer to bring to the victim. Problem is, the first paper studying this came out of Toronto. Steve Brooks was one of our investigators in the 2 big trials that I mentioned a short while ago. And he showed that of 1,200 notifications for cardiac arrest in the greater Toronto area, only 1% of the responders actually made it to the victim before EMS arrived. Now, when they do, it can make a dramatic difference. This is a photograph, a little bit blurry, that my former dean at VCU where I work sent to me because he knew of my role in AEDs, and I was just thrilled. He had just gotten back from a trip to New York City. He's a devout Catholic. He was in St. Patrick's Cathedral and saw that there was an AED on the wall, took a picture of it, and a couple of months later, he sent me this clipping that someone, a friend of his in New York, had taken out of the local newspaper. And it was 4 rescuers who were in a mass at St. Patrick's when a person collapsed, and they grabbed the AED, shocked the victim within a couple of minutes, and the victim survived neurologically intact. So we all know, of course, it works. In Europe, the experience with a pulse point-like system has actually been very positive, still small percentages, but certainly statistically significantly better than we've seen in North America. And it's not that their system is electronically any different. It's got a different name, it's a different company. It's the people. And the reason our colleagues in Europe explain to us Americans what they think is responsible for things being much more positive about bystanders being willing to respond is that there's a somewhat different culture in many of the particularly northern parts of Europe, in which, for example, if you're traveling on any of the autobahns or the major highways and you come across an accident, a car accident, you are actually required by law to stop. In the US and Canada, we hope people will stop to render assistance until EMS can get there. But in many of these countries, it's a requirement. This is a photograph of a very smart gentleman named Marcus Ong. Marcus is a physician. He's actually now, he's an emergency physician. He's at Singapore General in Singapore. And Marcus is now director of emergency services for the entire country. The city, state, it's the entire country. And he spent a year with me as a postdoc fellow shortly after his training. And when he went back home, he's actually put AEDs in the hands of some of the taxi cab drivers. We've actually explored that in the US, and the situation's a little different here in terms of the concern about liability and also the concern about unmarked vehicles, not lights and sirens vehicles, responding quickly through city streets when you've got police, fire, and EMS responding at the same time. So there are complex issues as to whether that really is, the way that we're going to see communities go. But theoretically, it certainly has some appeal, although the practical aspects do have some issues. So now let's forward to around 2015 to 2017. I'm a pilot. I actually fly a little prop jet, and I'm also a commercial drone pilot. And to be perfectly honest with you, until I've been flying for 23, 24 years. And my initial reaction when drones started to become much more widely used in the United States was of concern, about whether they posed a threat when I or others, commercial aircraft, military aircraft, fly in and out of major airports. I'm based at a major airport in Richmond International, and fly into things like BWI and Dulles and Atlanta and Dallas, et cetera. And so my initial concern was, to sort of have doubts about whether over the long haul drones were going to be more of a threat, at least to commercial aviation, than a benefit. But then I started to realize, wait a minute, they only are allowed legally to fly up to 400 feet above ground level. And what would happen if you could deliver an AED or something even smaller like naloxone spray to a bystander 911 caller at the scene of either a cardiac arrest or a opioid overdose? Well, back in 2015 to 2017, the regulations for the FAA, Federal Aviation Administration, really weren't going to allow drones to carry anything and deliver it. They could, and were being used for recreational purposes, and public safety was using them for surveillance type work and tactical work, police, fire, and EMS. But they weren't, there was no FAA regulation that would allow delivery of medical things. So I thought about it, and I thought, wait a minute, I work with the engineering students and the engineering faculty on various projects. What if we tried to put together a system to have a drone deliver naloxone? Even though I really wanted to deliver AEDs, an AED, the lightest one, is 3.5 pounds. Naloxone is 4 ounces. It weighs the same as the half a pack of gum. So I decided, well, if I'm going to fly from Virginia to California, there aren't any direct flights. You have to kind of go somewhere else, like Dallas, and then take a connector. So I thought, well, I can't go directly to ask the FAA to let me bring an AED. So let me try to test the concept. And why don't I target delivering naloxone spray to bystanders? And by then, we already had over 100,000 per year drug deaths in this country. And it sadly is continuing to be very large. So we put together a proposal and got an NIH grant for $300,000-400,000, put together a team of my folks at our university, as well as small industry in our the Richmond area that actually trains commercial drone pilots. And it turns out the guy that runs that company, called Virginia UAS, turns out his day job is he's a United Airlines captain who flies a Boeing 777 aircraft to Europe and Asia as half of his life, about two weeks of every month. And he's also got a small business for the last 15 or so years in Hollywood that does drone cinematography for Hollywood blockbusters. And he's actually won 2 Emmy Awards. It's like, holy crap. He's my team leader for training drone commercial pilots, and I'm obviously EMS and a pilot. We got our engineers together, and we do it. That's my aircraft on the bottom. Color me envious for what Scott flies. And this was our first team of engineering students, and we were able to put together a test system to basically have our operator at the 911 center, again, just for tests, not actually delivering anything, because the FAA rules did not yet allow even us to apply for such a thing. But we were able to interface the electronics that our students and faculty developed to our 911 system, so that a cell phone caller, and about 95 to 98% of calls in Virginia are by cell phone. That call has a GPS location within about 20 feet, goes into our 911 computer. And as soon as the call taker hears that it's a potential overdose, or in the future, a potential cardiac arrest, they can push a button and a drone is up in the air within 18 seconds en route to the GPS location of the caller. Now, the only twist is, of course, one of the first questions we ask is, are you with the victim? and not down the street watching, somebody a block away collapse on the ground. And that occurs, but it's a small percent. So we put a system together and proved that it worked. We then did a simulation on 30 volunteer opioid addicted recovering addicts in one of our recovery programs. And we asked them, we gave them for a 10-minute of their time simulation where they played the role of a rescuer on a medical emergency. That's what we asked them to do. We got them to formally in writing consent that was okay. They were willing to do it. And they were in a small room when we would consent them. Once they said, hey, I'll be happy to help out, we opened the door, and in the next room was a resuscitate Annie on a table. And we said, this is your best friend. They just collapsed. They've just taken an overdose, and handed them the phone. And on the phone was our 911 dispatcher who talked them through going outside of that room. It was on the first floor, walk through the lobby. And as soon as they get outside the door on the left-hand side, a drone has just landed and has naloxone spray on the top of it. Pick it up, bring it in, and stay on the phone, and I'll tell you what to do when you get to your victim. And it turned out that we were able to show that from the time we opened the door until they sprayed the naloxone in the nose was 2 minutes. And these were 30 recovering addicts in the past. And a number of them had actually been treated. Of course, they were the victim and they were unconscious. But the majority of them had really, no particular expertise in using these. So along comes a colleague of ours during this period of time in Sweden named Andreas Claesson.
112 operator, what is your emergency?
It's my dad. I think he had a heart attack. Please help. He's not breathing anymore.
Please stay calm. What's your name?
Joanna.
Good, Joanna. We've got your location. The ambulance drone is on its way. Remove his top shirt to uncover his torso.
Okay.
Great. Can you go to the nearest exit? The ambulance drone is almost there.
Okay. I'm outside.
I'll be talking through the drone now, so you can put down the phone.
Now please pick up the drone and bring it to your father.
You're doing great.
Okay, pull the green lid. Now place the pads on your father's chest. Good, I can see that the pads are properly applied. Joanna, please stay clear of your father. We'll take it from here.
Shock within 2 minutes. Now, this was just a simulation, but shortly after that, this was the first survivor that Andreas wrote a case report in the New England Journal of Medicine. Almost the same scenario. Drone arrived in 3 minutes, and the wife defibrillated her husband within 5 minutes, 30 seconds. Her husband awakened in the ambulance. He was fully neurologically back to normal. An implantable defibrillator was inserted a couple of days after he was admitted to the hospital. He was home perfectly back to normal on day 7. Now, in the city of Richmond, we figured out these are what are called heat maps that show where our opioid overdoses and where our cardiac arrests occur in our downtown 62.5 square mile area. Turns out we only need 6 drones, 6 locations to cover the city and guarantee over 90% of the time that we can deliver naloxone and an AED to a bystander call greater than 90% of the time within 2 minutes of pickup of the call at 911. Now, what would it cost? A drone of the category that we intend to use and that we're testing in the American Heart Project, I'll very quickly tell you about. They cost about anywhere from $30,000 to $60,000. You need a housing, you need a defibrillator, which is about $1,500, et cetera, et cetera. The total cost for the entire city to be covered is a little over $300,000. Now, in order to have a defibrillator available to every single person, either living, working, or visiting the city, for them to grab it and be back to a victim within 2 minutes or less, you'd have to put a defibrillator, an AED on, and naloxone on every other telephone pole. The cost of that would be almost $16 million. So in order to provide defibrillation capability in 2 or 3 minutes or 4 minutes, whatever it takes after the drone is at the victim's side, it's 50 times less expensive to do it with 6 drones than to have to put in 8,000 AEDs, not even counting the fact that they're going to be subject to the weather and theft and who's going to maintain them and the batteries. It's just not going to happen. And so we got Monique Starks, my dear friend and colleague, and I were awarded an American Heart 4-year grant a year ago. We're just starting year 2. This is the type of drone that we intend to fly. We're in the early testing stages. Because the grant was for suburban, rural, not urban, we had to pick counties that had suburbs and urban. We picked in Virginia, James City County, which is Williamsburg. She picked Forsyth County, which is in the western part of North Carolina. Here's Durham, here's Williamsburg, here's Richmond. And you can see that their populations are typical of suburbs and slash rural areas. This is the way we intend to deliver the drones by tether, a high hover about 115 feet above ground, rapid lowering of a box that contains the AED and or naloxone with a release. And they're relatively straightforward to put a program like this together under what now exists in the last year and a half called the Drone First Responder Program that the FAA has finally released that allows theoretically delivery of things like AEDs and naloxone. The problem is, very appropriately, you have to have lots of elements in place. We've trained and certified 8 Part 107 drone pilots in Forsyth County that work for the police department, and 8 drone pilots in Williamsburg, James City County that, again, are police officers. There are lots and lots of details, and we're in, as I said, the beginning of the 2nd year. We expect to be flying in Forsyth County in about 6 months and flying in about 3 or 6 months after that. So in our last 2 years, we'll be delivering AEDs. And this is a press conference that my colleague Monique Starks from Duke did. And then we're just about done.
Forsyth County Sheriff's Office showed off its new AED drone today.
It delivers life-saving devices before first responders can get to emergency situations. WFMY News 2's Hunter Funk shows us how it works.
Sudden cardiac arrest can be fatal, with every minute counting for your survival. These 4 wheels can only get you there so fast, but a new Forsyth County AED drone program can get to you in roughly half the time, no matter where you might be.
Forsyth County 911.
This is a simulation.
Hi, there's someone unconscious. I need help. Where you at, ma'am? I'm in a parking lot. I'm at a church off of Louisville Clemens Road.
There's going to be an AED drone that is going to be arriving to you.
We estimate that a drone can arrive on the scene of a person in cardiac arrest somewhere between 3 to 5 minutes, even before a first responder could. And that's what the incredible benefit of this, especially in our rural counties.
It's taking a large partnership to make this happen. Duke University received more than $4 million from the American Heart Association, which is turning its 6-year research into reality.
I had chills
just seeing this in action, even though it's a simulation, seeing it in action for the first time and knowing that over the next few months that this is going to become an integrated part of emergency medical care.
The Forsyth County Sheriff hopes it'll propel even more opportunities to save lives.
So many things that we can deliver with this. We can deliver medicine. And thinking about it, imagine having them in locations throughout your county. So someone calls in 911 emergency. The same way we launch a drone for first responders, we can launch an AED remotely.
A bystander will need to use the AED. The county plans to help teach people how to use it, and the program is expected to be launched by the fall. In Forsyth County, Hunter Funk, WFMY News 2.
So in conclusion, I hope you can see where I'm coming from in that we really do have effective therapy for the majority of out-of-hospital cardiac arrest victims, but time is really the enemy to get that life-saving treatment, CPR, particularly followed by rapid defibrillation on board. And I hopefully have shown you how this concept has been limited by the technology and by the regulatory environment, but that pretty much is changing very rapidly. We're privileged to be among the first, not the only ones, but among the first to be working in an experimental sense to test this concept and to really develop a set of sort of ground rules as to how communities can explore whether such service in the future might be for them. So I'll stop here and I'll be happy to address any questions that anyone might have.
Looks like Kier has a question.
Great.
Thanks a lot, Mary and Dr. Ornato. Thank you. That was really an awesome presentation. And Mary knows I've participated in a number of the webinars she's put together and post-survivor groups and also discussions from experts like you. I'm up the road from you in Rappahannock County, Virginia, which adjoins the Shenandoah National Park.
Yeah.
And we have a population of 7,300 people. So we're talking, I guess, extreme rural.
Right.
So the summer of 2022, I suffered out of hospital sudden cardiac arrest. And you might be thinking, wow, you're very fortunate to live in a rural area and be alive. But here's the point. I was actually in my hometown in Wisconsin when it happened, 3 blocks from a firehouse. And I was fortunate to get bystander CPR for my wife and a 3-minute response from professional ALS paramedics. And needless to say, my wife now would prefer not to live in Rappahannock County, Virginia, but this is where we live. And long story short, I'm a member of the Rappahannock County Board of Supervisors. And you can imagine, based on my personal experience surviving sudden cardiac arrest, I'm a bit on my high horse here because I look at our volunteer fire and rescue system and I know, based on what I endured, which was a 3-month hospital stay in a coma, an ECMO, et cetera, that most people in my county, when they suffer a sudden cardiac arrest, don't have a chance. So to that end, we are about to deploy as many AEDs as makes sense. I'd love to put one, as you said, on every other telephone pole, but we're not going to do that. But we've got a plan, and I've got private donors, and we'll put some county money in. We're going to deploy AEDs everywhere we can, and we're doing widespread CPR training. And I was so looking forward to this presentation because, to me, it seems, depending on the outcome of your project, and I guess this is where I want to ask you, if this AED drone delivery technology becomes, $300,000 for enrichment doesn't seem like a lot, and we could swing that probably. Would it make sense for a community like ours, number one, with 7,000 people, over 200 square miles, and number two, would it make a difference?
Yeah, short answer is not in the very, very near future.
Okay.
Meaning weeks or months. But however, conceptually, this concept, at least as I view it, absolutely is possible to serve not just urban and suburbs, but also rural, not remote, but reasonable population density rural areas. But, and here's the but I've got an answer for the but. The model that I think we're going to evolve towards is one that's very similar to the air traffic control system. It's not going to be realistic to have round the clock FAA certified drone pilots waiting for that once every blue moon cardiac arrest to occur in every community. That's just unrealistic, but that's totally unnecessary. And what I think is going to happen is going to be very similar to what our military currently does, which is you could have a drone, and we do have drones halfway around the world that are being piloted 24/7 by teams of military drone pilots that are just, by relay through satellite, getting real-time video and can completely control what that drone does and what it delivers. And I think what we're going to evolve towards, hopefully if we're capable of proving the concept, is a system whereby a much larger area can be covered by a relatively small number of drone pilots that could provide 24/7 coverage. And that literally, we can send a drone to a GPS caller location, as I said, with it up in the air in 20 seconds from the request coming in. And then it's just a matter of the drone pilot legally, monitoring the travel of that drone, and at destination verifying, that there's someone on the ground that's going to be receiving it, putting it in a high hover so as to be safe in case the drone suddenly goes out of control. Kind of technology we're using. We can remotely fire a rocket-powered parachute on the drone if it completely goes out of control, so that it, instead of falling like a rock, it comes down very softly. And these are the kinds of things that are required by the FAA. By the way, the pilot is not hand flying the drone. We're flying it what's called autonomously by the computer controlling it to the GPS location. One of the rate limiters right now is systems need to be in place to make sure that that aircraft avoids any other aircraft, particularly low-flying helicopters. And although we don't have the mature technology off the shelf at an affordable price to do that right now, it's not very far away. Our project, the Virginia side of the American Heart Project, we have a partnership with NASA Langley. They happen to be in Virginia, and they are very interested in our project. And it turns out the national lab for the FAA and NASA
5 p.m.
is actually in Tidewater. It's only about 40 minutes from Williamsburg. And the guy that runs that program is one of our informal advisors to our program. He's actually doing all of the testing for the FAA on the next generation of devices that will allow a drone to see and avoid and take evasive maneuvers if another aircraft is approaching, like a helicopter. And so the pace of technology change is very rapid right now. And I think the vision that I just represented to you, I think within 3 to 5 years, is going to be technologically supportable.
Okay.
To be able to, begin to have conversations with how could we provide this kind of service without it being a financial burden,
right,
and and a practical impossibility to provide 24/7 coverage, even for urban and suburban areas. I think that's all going to be much, much more solvable at a very, very tiny price by what's already happening in terms of technology and the regulatory side from the FAA.
Okay, it sounds like I might have to run for re-election one more time then, so I'm around.
Yeah, stay tuned. Stay tuned. Really exciting time.
Yeah,
but thank
really
you.
is.
Thank you so much. You're right on target with
yeah, and I think my colleagues and I may come knocking on your door in the not too distant future and buy you lunch.
Absolutely.
So, all right,
yeah,
great. Thanks
absolutely. I'd love
Thanks
it. Thank you so much for listening in.
Dr. Ornato, we're at the end of the hour, but I see a few other people have questions. So
okay.
If you don't mind, we'll continue a little bit.
Yeah, I'm great. Sure.
Okay. Francisco?
Yeah, thank you, Doctor. What occurred to me is that if we were to put a research grant in to look at drone AEDs being carried by drones here in England, we'd have to show how we would apply health equity. So we'd look at some of the towns that have got high-rise flats, and knowing I'm aware of Andre Klassen's work in Gothenburg, and I realize some of the limitations around bad weather, high winds, high-rise blocks of flat. You know, if we were to be successful, we'd actually ensure that nobody gets left behind. So we'd have to train the wardens in the high-rise blocks to be familiar with being able maybe to deliver, and hopefully the escalators not being out of action. But here's the deal, okay? You know the figures of 10%. You know the survival rate after 30 days or the lack of it. And reality is there's a certain population that by its very nature will have to be excluded or could be excluded because the time of year, the weather and such forth. So it isn't something that's equitable for all people within that community. And what would you say could mitigate that? Or is it just the reality of how things are?
Well, you know, I think the solution of making early defibrillation accessible, as I view it, is the way to solve the issue, the moral issue of equity. Let me say that a different way. High-rise buildings are a challenge. Densely populated urban areas are a challenge, and probably no time in anywhere near our foreseeable future are drones going to be delivering anything in those environments. In an early part of my career, many years ago, my first stint as the EMS medical director was in New York City. That's the quintessential in our country, you know, high-rise metropolis. And I ran at the time, the only 24/7 paramedic service in the city as the physician medical director. In that type of an environment, we're nowhere close to having drones safely being allowed to fly in those kinds of environments. So I think in those kinds of environments, you really have to pre-deploy the AEDs inside the buildings, like we do in hospitals. In our hospital, for example, every other floor has an AED next to the elevator. And I think, you know, in most public buildings that aren't, you know, 100 stories high, the AED should be in the lobby next to the elevator. That's the usual place that they're, you know, they're placed. So to me, the equity is, however you're making early defibrillation available, whether it's flying it in or whether it's pre-deploying it, if you've got a lot of people that are going to be covered by that AED because you've got, you know, hundreds of them in that building, to me, morally, you're meeting the requirement for equity. But I don't see drones, at least any time in the foreseeable future, being safe or regulatory-wise allowed to function in densely populated areas.
Thank you,
but it's a good question, and thank you. And say hi to all my friends in UK.
And Maya, you have a question?
Hi. Yes. So I don't have a question. I just have a comment. I'm from the Illinois Heart Rescue Program. So we
Great.
provide free CPR training. We distribute Narcan, and we also do AED grants. So I just wanted to say that this was very informative, and thank you for your talk. I really enjoyed it.
Oh, well, you're very kind, and thank you so much for what you're doing. Everything that you've just described is really remarkable, and I'm terribly envious. You guys are obviously doing great work. Congrats.
Thank you. Thank you.
And Brian?
Yes, thank you, Doctor, for a very fascinating, informative presentation. You referred to being a principal investigator on some randomized trials.
Yes.
And I was thinking about that, and I'm wondering, what is the treatment you're randomizing? I think it might have been whether AEDs were available in that area. What were the purpose of those trials?
Well, sure. The first trial was the one I mentioned, the so-called public access defibrillation trial that was run in the early 2000s. That was a trial funded by National Heart, Lung, Blood Institute at National Institutes of Health. And that was where we trained 19,000 lay people to recognize cardiac arrest, to do CPR, call 911, and use an AED. That was before the FDA allowed lay people to use them. So we had to get special permission, which we obtained from the FDA for 18 months of this trial to be done, where we were randomizing. Half the time, the lay rescuers had access to an AED that they could fetch within a minute and bring it back within less than a minute and use it on the victim. And the reason that trial had to be done was because the FDA, we tried to get the FDA to just simply change their rules and allow lay people to have access to AEDs, because physicians who work in this area felt they were really quite safe and obviously highly effective when used quickly. But the Food and Drug Administration, their role is safety as well as effectiveness. And based on their rules, we had 7 or 8 years of conversations with them, and they basically said we cannot approve allowing lay people to use these devices unless someone does a large randomized trial showing not only that they're effective, but that they're safe, and that the lay people weren't going to hurt anyone with these. And so it then took us several years, but we were able to get the National Institutes of Health to fund about $10.5 million for the trial. We had the implantable defibrillator manufacturers provide a couple of more $1 million of funding. And we had the AED manufacturers donate 1,500 AEDs for the trial. And at the end of the trial, the sites that participated got to keep them for free. And so that's how we did that first trial, based on the success of the trial in allowing the FDA to make AEDs available to the public. We applied for funding for what turned out to then be 12 years of funding in what was called the Resuscitation Outcomes Consortium. And that involved 10 metro areas, 2 Canadian and 8 US metro areas. That was the slide I showed you. I was privileged, as in the public access defibrillation trial, to be chosen by NIH to chair the cardiac arrest trials that were done. And over the next 12 years, we studied everything from the actual sequence of how you initiate the pumping on the chest, whether you pump for 2 or 3 minutes and then defibrillate, or whether you defibrillate earlier than that. Around 2005 or 6, there were 2 schools of thought, and no one knew which one was best. and we were able to do that trial. In addition to that, we did trials that, again, involved anywhere from a few thousand to over 20,000 cardiac arrest out of hospital victims. Some of our trials, we tested various drugs that are used to help restart the heart, that are drugs that were being used by EMS, but no one had actually tested one against the other in a randomized trial. And we were able to test them, all fully approved drugs. They weren't, things that weren't being used, but we tried to, and we did try to find out whether one was better than another to try to figure out the best way of treating victims, and so on and so forth. We did a series of trials over 12 years, and based on most of the work that was done, the latest updates since about 2020 and now 2025, the latest updates of the American Heart resuscitation guidelines were heavily influenced by what our teams discovered over that 12-year period. Hope that answers your question.
And I think Joe Farrell has a question too.
Hi, Joe.
Hey, Joe. Thanks for the great.
How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for asking. And I loved your presentation. And you and I might have had a little talk about this in the past, but it might be interesting. As you know, I'm very involved with Pulse Point as well as cardiac arrest foundation.
Sure.
I'm on the
Yeah.
board.
Yep.
And is there has there been any conversation, say, with the founder, President Rich Price, about somehow integrating this concept of drones and AEDs, because Pulse Point is now in 5,700 municipalities and cities in the United States. So
Yep.
that's my
Yep.
question.
I think it's a fabulous question, and I think inevitably, absolutely, the two concepts, and certainly the service needs to get together, because that really makes absolutely all the sense in the world to me. The problem is we're really just putting in our toes in the water of this concept, not because the technology is not there, but because the FAA has literally, in less than the last 18 months, released regulations that are permitting this to be done. And what it takes to get through meeting all of the requirements is not for the faint of heart. It is still a very, very complex process. That's going to change, but we're really the first, and there are a few other sites in the country that, not as part of a randomized trial, but that are beginning to implement similar kind of service. And I think once we get a little bit farther downrange with a couple of our programs, certainly over the next 2 to 5 years, hopefully we'll have enough of a sense of, does the concept work? How much is it really costing? Can we sustain it in terms of having more than a few hours a day coverage? Is it going to continue to be as safe as we think it is? One bad, sadly, accident where a drone comes down and, causes harm. This is going to be, a very visible, terrible event if, God forbid, it occurs early in any of our programs. So, I mean, there's a lot that I think is all surmountable, but I think it's a little bit too early to really flesh out, how this is going to wind up interfacing with EMS agencies, and absolutely with Pulse Point, because that's the bang for the buck. You got a responder that can go and pump on the chest, and you can actually bring the drone the AED to them by drone or very close to them, as opposed to, whether it's within a 2-minute fetch by them running. I mean, I think the two concepts are absolutely, totally synergistic.
Thanks, Joe. And perhaps we should all start talking now and prep.
Yeah.
It takes time, as you know. It takes a long time.
You bet. Yeah, I'm in.
Thanks. All right, buddy. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Yeah,
very
thanks,
much.
Joe.
Yeah, I think we need to wrap it up now.
Sure.
But I want to thank you again, Dr. Ornato, for a great presentation, and really appreciate this. So interesting. So thanks again.
Well, thanks, Mary, for coordinating, and thanks to everyone who joined us. Y'all stay safe. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks again, Joe.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.